April 18, 1861. Robert E. Lee is handed an envelope. Inside, an offer to command the entire Union Army, the most powerful military position in the Western Hemisphere. He opens it, he reads it, he sets it down, then he writes his resignation from the United States Army, the institution he had served for 32 years. He was offered everything: history, glory, the chance to end a war before it truly began. He walked away from all of it. That one decision will cost 600,000 lives, and the argument it started has never stopped. June 2020, Richmond, Virginia, the city that once served as the capital of the Confederate States of America. A crowd pulls a statue of Jefferson Davis off its pedestal. It crashes into the street. Shouting, some people cheer, others, watching from the sidewalk or from their phones, feel something closer to grief. That moment, that single rope, that single statue, that single crowd, touched off a national argument that consumed the country for weeks. Hundreds of Confederate monuments came down across America. Dozens of others were defended, surrounded, protected. In some cities, counter-protesters stood guard around the statues through the night. A war that ended in 1865 was still making Americans angry in 2020, still making them choose sides. Think about that. Most countries, after a century and a half, have moved past their wars. They study them. They memorialize them. They put them in textbooks. They do not fight about them in the streets. America has never been able to do that with the Civil War. And the reason goes deeper than most people want to admit. The American Civil War claimed between 620,000 and 750,000 lives. The exact number is still disputed by historians, which is itself telling. A 2012 study by historian J. David Hacker pushed the estimate as high as $850,000, when previously uncounted deaths from disease, starvation, and exposure are included. That number exceeds American deaths in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since, combined. More Americans died fighting each other than fighting any external enemy in the entire history of the Republic. And yet, the argument about what that war was for has never stopped. Not in 1865, not in 1965, not today. Was it about slavery? 11 Southern states said so, plainly, in their secession declarations. Mississippi's, written in January 1861, opens with these words: "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Was it about states' rights? Southern politicians and their descendants would argue so, for a century and a half afterward. Was it about economics? About culture? About honor? About the constitutional limits of federal power? The answer is yes, to all of it. And the fact that those answers contradict each other is exactly why the argument never ends. The Civil War was many things at once: a military conflict, a political crisis, a moral reckoning, and a story that different Americans have told differently for 160 years, because the story they tell says something about who they believe they are. 4 years of war, 4 generations of argument, the story of why Americans still cannot agree, starts 40 years before the first shot was fired. 1820. The United States is 44 years old. It has survived a revolution, a second war with Britain, and the philosophical contradiction built into its founding documents. The assertion that all men are created equal, written by men who owned human beings. The contradiction had been managed, carefully, uncomfortably, but managed. The Constitution of 1787 counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power, without granting enslaved people any rights at all. It was a deal, a compromise that allowed the nation to exist, and a time bomb buried in its foundation. Missouri wants to join the Union as a slave state. The North objects. For 3 months, the United States Congress debates whether the country can survive the question. Henry Clay of Kentucky engineers a compromise. Missouri enters as a slave state, Maine as a free state. A line is drawn at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, dividing future slave territory from free. Thomas Jefferson, then 76 years old, watching from his estate at Monticello, writes to a friend about the Missouri crisis. He calls it a fire bell in the night. He says it awakened and filled me with terror. He predicts it will end in disunion. Jefferson was right. He would just be wrong about the timeline. The economics of the argument were not abstract. By 1860, the southern states grew roughly 75% of the world's cotton. That cotton fed the textile mills of Lancashire in England and Lowell in Massachusetts. Southern cotton exports in 1860 were worth $191 million, 57% of all American exports. The value of enslaved people in the South, measured as property, as capital, was estimated at $3.5 billion. That was more than the total value of all factories and railroads in America combined. Let that land. The entire Southern economy, its wealth, its political power, its social structure, rested on the labor of 4 million enslaved human beings. To the plantation class, abolition was not just a moral question. It was an existential economic threat. The equivalent, in their minds, of someone proposing to confiscate every bank, every factory, every farm in the country overnight. They were not willing to accept that. And they had the political power to resist it. For decades, the Senate had been engineered to maintain a balance between slave and free states. Every time a free state entered the Union, a slave state followed. The Missouri Compromise held the balance, barely. Then came the Mexican War of 1846. The United States won 1 million square miles of new territory: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and immediately faced the same question: slave or free? The Compromise of 1850 patched it together again. California enters free. New Mexico and Utah get to decide for themselves. And the North gets a new fugitive slave law, requiring Northern citizens and law enforcement to return escaped enslaved people to their owners, even in states where slavery was illegal. The North hated it. The South demanded it. 4 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 effectively repealed the old compromise line. Any territory, anywhere, could now vote to allow slavery. The fury this caused in the North was unlike anything seen before. It destroyed the Whig Party and created, in its ruins, the Republican Party. Built around one core principle: no more expansion of slavery. Kansas became a battlefield before the Civil War did. Pro-slavery settlers poured in from Missouri. Anti-slavery settlers came from New England, backed by organizations sending them rifles in crates labeled Bibles. 2 rival governments, 2 constitutions, 2 capitals. Guerrilla raids, murders, arson, a town sacked, and on the floor of the United States Senate, a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks walked up to Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who had just delivered a searing anti-slavery speech, and beat him unconscious with a metal-tipped cane. Sumner was so badly injured he could not return to his Senate seat for 3 years. Massachusetts left the seat empty as a symbol of Southern violence. Brooks was celebrated as a hero in South Carolina. People sent him commemorative canes. 2 sides of the same country were now looking at each other across a chasm that no compromise could bridge. Then came Harper's Ferry. October 16, 1859. John Brown, a radical abolitionist who believed he had been personally commanded by God, led 18 followers, including 5 black men, to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan: arm enslaved people across the South and trigger a massive rebellion. The raid lasted 36 hours. A company of U.S. Marines, under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, crushed it. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged on December 2, 1859. On the morning of his execution, Brown handed a note to one of his jailers. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." In the North, Brown was mourned as a martyr. Henry David Thoreau called him an angel of light. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Christ. In the South, that reaction confirmed everything they feared. The North did not just want to contain slavery, it wanted to destroy it, and was willing to use violence to do so. The South's response was to begin stockpiling weapons. And then, in November 1860, Americans went to the polls. What they voted for would blow the whole thing apart. November 6, 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency of the United States. He wins with less than 40% of the popular vote. He receives 0 electoral votes from any southern state. He does not even appear on the ballot in 10 of them. Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He has publicly stated he will not interfere with slavery where it already exists. He does not believe the federal government has the constitutional authority to do so. But the South does not believe him. They see his Republican Party as the political arm of an anti-slavery movement that will, eventually, destroy everything they have built. 6 weeks after the election, South Carolina secedes. The state legislature votes 169 to 0. Their declaration of secession is worth reading carefully because it is explicit. It accuses northern states of failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. It describes Lincoln's election as proof the North intends to destroy the institution of our domestic slavery. Slavery. They say it directly. Mississippi follows. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Their words. Not interpretation, not extrapolation, their words. By February 1861, 6 more states have followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They gather in Montgomery, Alabama on February 4th and form the Confederate States of America. They choose Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War, as their president. Davis had not wanted secession. He had argued for it only as a last resort. But now that it had come, he accepted the role with a grim sense of duty. The time for compromise, he said, has now passed. The Confederate Constitution, drafted in a matter of days, is nearly identical to the U.S. Constitution. With some critical differences, it explicitly protects the institution of slavery. It forbids the Confederate Congress from passing any law denying or impairing the right of property in enslaved people. States that joined the Confederacy could not abolish slavery, even if they wanted to. This matters enormously. Because for 150 years after the war, the states' rights argument dominated how the Confederacy explained itself. But the Confederate Constitution actually restricted states' rights on the question of slavery, ensuring no Confederate state could ever move toward abolition on its own. Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, made the point with startling clarity in his cornerstone speech of March 1861. The Confederate government's foundations are laid, he said, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. He did not hedge. He did not use euphemisms. He said the cornerstone, the foundation, was racial hierarchy, the right to own human beings. Lincoln was sworn in on March 4, 1861. His inaugural address was a plea for peace. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed. He argued secession was illegal. No state had the constitutional right to leave the Union. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. In the South, few were listening. There was one last question. Would there be a war? The answer came at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter sits in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, on a man-made island of granite. It was built to protect the harbor from foreign navies. Nobody imagined it would be the place where Americans started killing each other. Major Robert Anderson commands 85 Union soldiers inside the fort. Confederate forces have surrounded the harbor with guns. South Carolina has demanded the fort be surrendered. Anderson has refused. He has food for about 6 days. No resupply ships are coming. Lincoln faces an impossible choice. Send food and risk triggering war. Abandon the fort and appear to legitimize secession. He chooses to send food. Only food. No weapons. No reinforcements. He informs the Confederate government he is doing so. Confederate President Jefferson Davis makes his own choice. Attack before the supplies arrive. April 12, 1861, 4:30 in the morning. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, who had studied artillery at West Point under Robert Anderson himself, opens fire on his former professor. 34 hours of bombardment follow. 3,341 shells fall on the fort. The walls crack and crumble. Fires break out inside. Anderson holds out for over a day. Then, with the fort on fire and his ammunition nearly gone, he surrenders. In one of history's grimmer ironies, not a single Union soldier dies in combat during the entire bombardment. 2 die in an accidental cannon explosion during the surrender ceremony. The first deaths of the Civil War are accidents. The reaction in the North is immediate and overwhelming. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. Men queue for miles to enlist. The New York Times calls for war. Men who had disagreed about slavery unite around one thing. Nobody fires on the American flag. In the South, the reaction is equally electric. But in the other direction, Lincoln's call for troops is seen as a declaration of war. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which had previously refused to secede, now leave the Union. The Confederacy suddenly has 4 more states, 5 million more people, and the strategic depth of the entire Appalachian mountain chain. More importantly, it has Robert E. Lee. On April 18th, Lincoln's General-in-Chief Winfield Scott offers Lee command of the principal Union Army. Lee is 54 years old, a decorated veteran of the Mexican War. Widely regarded as the finest military officer in the country, he is personally opposed to secession. He has written that he considers slavery a moral and political evil. He tells Scott he needs time to think. The next morning, April 20th, he resigns his commission. "I cannot raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home," he writes to Scott. "Save in defense of my native state. I have no desire ever again to draw my sword." Virginia is his country. He goes with Virginia. There is one more detail about Fort Sumter worth knowing. Edmund Ruffin, a 67-year-old Virginia secessionist who had campaigned for disunion for decades, was given the honor of firing one of the first shots. He had white hair and wild eyes and reportedly wept with joy as the guns opened fire. Edmund Ruffin would live to see the Confederacy's final defeat in April 1865. On June 18, 1865, having written in his diary that he refused to survive the subjugation of the South, he put a rifle in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Nobody knew it yet. Not Lincoln, not Davis, not Anderson, not Ruffin, but the easy part was over. On paper, this war should not have lasted 4 years. The numbers favor the Union in almost every category that military strategists care about. Population, 22 million in the North, 9 million in the South, and 3.5 million of those are enslaved people who have every reason to want the Confederacy to lose. Manufacturing. The North has 110,000 factories and workshops. The South has 18,000. Railroads, 22,000 miles in the North, 9,000 in the South. Money. The North has a functioning national banking system. The Confederacy will spend most of the war in financial crisis, printing paper money so fast that by 1864, a Confederate dollar is worth about 1 cent. The Union also has a navy. The Confederacy has almost nothing at sea. By any rational calculation, the South should have been defeated in months. It wasn't. And the reasons why tell you something important about how wars are actually won and lost. The Confederacy did not need to conquer the North. It just needed to not lose. To make the war so costly, so painful, so long, that the Northern public would eventually demand that Lincoln negotiate. It was a strategy of exhaustion, and for 2 years, it came dangerously close to working. The Confederate military also had something the Union lacked in the early years: better generals. 7 of the 8 military colleges in the country were in the South. Southern society placed enormous value on military honor and service. Officers like Thomas Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and J.E.B. Stuart had grown up in a culture that treated military excellence as a defining virtue. And at the top was Robert E. Lee. Thoughtful. Lee was not a simple man. He inherited enslaved people and fought a lawsuit to delay their freedom. He personally oversaw the whipping of 3 enslaved people who attempted to escape in 1859, a detail documented by Wesley Norris, one of the survivors, in a newspaper account published in 1866. But as a military commander, he was something extraordinary. Aggressive when his opponents expected caution. Audacious when logic said hold back. Willing to divide his army in the face of a larger enemy, and win anyway. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, outnumbered more than 2 to 1, Lee divided his army into 3 separate forces in the face of the enemy and won one of the most complete victories of the war. His opponent, Union General Joseph Hooker, was so stunned by Lee's audacity that he simply froze. The Union's first great test came on July 21, 1861. The First Battle of Bull Run, near Manassas, Virginia, less than 30 miles from Washington. Washington society followed in carriages and on horseback, bringing picnic baskets and opera glasses to watch the army put down the rebellion. By afternoon, the Union line had broken. Soldiers fled back toward Washington in a panic, tangled with the civilian spectators, blocking the roads, abandoning wagons and artillery. Confederate forces, exhausted and disorganized themselves, could not pursue. Washington was stunned. The 90-day war, men had literally enlisted for 90 days, was revealed as a fantasy. Lincoln sat awake through the night reading battlefield dispatches. 2 days later, he signed legislation authorizing the enlistment of 500,000 men for 3 years of service. Both sides needed a strategy. Lincoln's general had one. The problem was, the general wasn't sure he believed in it. General Winfield Scott was 74 years old, too fat to ride a horse, and suffering from dropsy and vertigo. He was the commanding general of the U.S. Army, and his strategic vision for winning the war was one of the most sophisticated plans of the entire conflict. He called for a naval blockade of the entire Confederate coastline, 3,500 miles of it, combined with a thrust down the Mississippi River to cut the Confederacy in half, strangle it, isolate it, let economic pressure do the work that soldiers would otherwise have to do with their lives. The newspapers mocked it as the Anaconda plan, squeezing the life out of the South like a giant snake. Scott didn't care. He told Lincoln it would take 2 to 3 years and 300,000 men. Lincoln thought that was too slow. The public thought it was cowardly. They wanted a quick, decisive strike. They got Bull Run instead. After Bull Run, the Union turned to George McClellan, young, brilliant, and extraordinarily cautious. He spent months transforming raw recruits into the finest military force the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. The Army of the Potomac, beautifully equipped, brilliantly organized. And then, he refused to use it. McClellan consistently overestimated Confederate strength by a factor of 2 or 3. When Confederate forces placed wooden logs painted black to look like cannons, what soldiers called Quaker guns, McClellan believed them to be real and refused to advance. He believed Lee had 200,000 men, when Lee rarely had more than 75,000. Lincoln famously wrote to him, "If General McClellan isn't going to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." While McClellan hesitated in the East, a Union general in the West was fighting a very different kind of war. Ulysses S. Grant had been a failure at almost everything before the war. He'd resigned from the Army in 1854, reportedly over a drinking problem, failed at farming, failed at real estate, failed at bill collecting. He was working as a leather goods clerk in his family's store in Galena, Illinois, when the war started. He volunteered immediately, February 16, 1862, Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner, an old friend of Grant's, requests terms of surrender at Fort Donelson, Tennessee. Grant's reply was 5 words that made him famous overnight. No terms, except unconditional and immediate surrender. 12,000 to 14,000 Confederate soldiers marched into captivity, the largest surrender of soldiers in American history to that point. The Union had opened the door to the Confederate heartland. 2 months later came Shiloh, April 6 and 7, 1862. Shiloh, Tennessee, named after a small Methodist church on the battlefield. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston launches a surprise attack on Grant's army near Pittsburgh Landing. The Union line nearly collapses. Johnston himself is killed in the first day's fighting. Hit by a bullet behind the knee, he bleeds to death when his surgeon, who had been sent to treat wounded soldiers elsewhere, isn't there to apply pressure to the wound. That night, with Union troops pushed to the river's edge, rain pouring, men sheltering under trees, General William Sherman finds Grant standing in the dark, smoking a cigar. "Well, Grant," Sherman says, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant takes the cigar from his mouth. "Yes," he says. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Reinforcements arrived overnight. The next day, Grant counterattacked and drove the Confederates from the field. The cost, 23,746 casualties over 2 days, more than all previous American wars combined. The North is horrified. Newspaper headlines call for Grant's removal. Stories circulate that he was drunk during the battle. Lincoln refuses to fire him. "I can't spare this man," the president says. "He fights." Historians still argue about Grant's methods. His critics, then and now, say his willingness to accept mass casualties was a failure of imagination. His defenders say Grant understood something his opponents didn't. The war could only be won by destroying the Confederate Army's ability to fight. And that required fighting it. Both things can be true. Grant was a killer. Grant also won the war. And somewhere in the middle of 1862, Lincoln was running out of time. The public was tired of the war. The casualties were staggering. The strategy wasn't producing results. He needed something that would change the meaning of the whole enterprise. He had been working on it in secret, waiting for the right moment. He just needed a victory to announce it. If you want more untold stories from America's wars, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming. September 22nd, 1862. Abraham Lincoln walks into the cabinet room of the White House. His secretaries describe him as looking tired and strained. He hasn't slept more than a few hours in days. He sits down, picks up a piece of paper. He opens by reading a passage from a comic novel by Artemus Ward. He laughs. The cabinet does not. He puts the book down and reads the document. Then he tells them he is not asking for their opinions. The decision is made. He is informing them of what will happen. 5 days later, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is published. Effective January 1st, 1863. All enslaved people held in states currently in rebellion against the United States are declared, then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation did not immediately free a single person. The Confederate States did not recognize Lincoln's authority. Border states, still in the Union, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, were explicitly exempted. Lincoln needed them, and he lacked the constitutional authority to free enslaved people in states that had not seceded. Critics then and now have seized on this. The proclamation freed the enslaved people Lincoln had no power over, and left in bondage those he could have freed. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former enslaved man, initially called it a measure apparently inspired by the ethics of selfishness. But Douglass's view evolved, because what the proclamation did, what it irrevocably did, was change the nature of the war. Before January 1st, 1863, the Union was fighting to restore the OLD nation. After it, the Union was fighting to create a new one. The institution of slavery was now, officially, the enemy. That changed everything in Europe. Britain and France had been weighing recognition of the Confederacy as an independent nation. which would have been catastrophic for the Union, providing diplomatic legitimacy, potential loans, possibly even military support. But both nations had abolished slavery decades earlier. Their working classes were intensely sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause. After the Emancipation Proclamation, no European government could align with the Confederacy without appearing to support human slavery. The diplomatic door slammed shut, and the proclamation opened another door, to black military service. By the end of the war, 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, 18,000 more in the Navy. Nearly 40,000 of them died. They were paid $10 a month to the white soldiers $13, given inferior equipment, assigned disproportionately to fatigue duty and the most dangerous assignments. Confederate forces routinely massacred black prisoners rather than taking them captive, most infamously at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, in April 1864, where Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest killed hundreds of Union soldiers, many of them black men, after they had surrendered. And still, they fought. July 18, 1863, Morris Island, South Carolina. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, one of the first black units in the Union Army, leads the assault on Confederate Fort Wagner. Their commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, is 25 years old, white, from a wealthy Boston abolitionist family. He knows the assault is likely suicidal. He tells General Seymour as much the night before. He leads the charge anyway. The regiment reaches the walls of the fort. Shaw is shot through the heart. Half the regiment falls. The assault fails. Confederate soldiers bury Shaw in a mass grave with his soldiers, an intended insult. Shaw's father, informed of this, responds, "We would not have his body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers." Here is a detail most people do not know about the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln drafted it on July 22, 1862, a full 2 months before he announced it. Secretary of State William Seward talked him out of releasing it immediately. "Mr. President," Seward said, "it may be viewed as the last shriek on the retreat. They needed a Union victory first, so the proclamation would read as strength, not desperation. The victory came at Antietam, and Antietam almost didn't go the way it did." September 17, 1862, Sharpsburg, Maryland, the Antietam Creek. By the end of this day, 22,717 Americans will be killed, wounded, or reported missing. More Americans will die today than on any other single day in the nation's military history, before or since. It begins with a cornfield. Union General Joseph Hooker's corps attacks Confederate forces positioned in a 30-acre cornfield at dawn. The corn is shoulder high. Men disappear into it and emerge, or don't, at the other end. Over the next 3 hours, the cornfield changes hands 15 times. Hooker will later write, "Every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before." But how did Lee's army end up in Maryland at all? The answer involves one of the most extraordinary accidents in military history. In early September 1862, Lee had invaded the North for the first time. He divided his army into 4 separate columns, coordinating a complex operation across the Maryland countryside. The plan was detailed. The coordination was meticulous. And then someone lost the plan. On September 13, 1862, a Union corporal named Barton Mitchell, resting with his regiment in a field near Frederick, Maryland, found an envelope in the grass. Inside, 3 cigars, wrapped in paper. The paper, when unfolded, turned out to be Special Order 191, Robert E. Lee's complete operational plan. Addressed to Confederate General D.H. Hill, showing the exact position and movement of every division in Lee's army. Within hours, the order reached General McClellan. He reportedly exclaimed, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He told Lincoln he had a plan that would end the war in a week. Then he waited 18 hours before acting on it. McClellan had the information to destroy Lee's divided army piece by piece. Instead, he moved cautiously, allowing Confederate forces time to concentrate. A Confederate sympathizer who happened to see McClellan with the order may have warned Lee. Historians debate this point. What is undisputed? By the time McClellan attacked, Lee had managed to consolidate most of his army. Still, the Union had advantages that should have meant a decisive victory. At the center of the battlefield, Union forces attack across a stone bridge over Antietam Creek, a bridge so narrow that men can only cross it 3 abreast. General Burnside orders assault after assault against 500 Georgia sharpshooters on the bluffs above. For 3 hours, 12,500 Union soldiers cannot cross a bridge that, as a Union colonel later noted, they could have waded the creek and flanked at any point. By the time Burnside finally forces the crossing, Confederate General A.P. Hill's division arrives from Harper's Ferry, 17 miles away, marching at double-quick time. They slam into Burnside's flank. The Union advance stops. By nightfall, Lee's army is battered. McClellan has 20,000 fresh reserves he never committed. He watches Lee retreat across the Potomac and does not follow. Lincoln arrives at the battlefield 9 days later and urges McClellan to advance. McClellan refuses. Lincoln returns to Washington and, on November 5th, fires him. But the battle had served its purpose. 5 days after the fighting, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Photographer Alexander Gardner traveled to Antietam and took photographs of the battlefield dead. The first photographs most Americans had ever seen of war's reality. They were displayed in Brady's New York Gallery in October 1862. The New York Times wrote, "If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it." Americans stood in line for hours to look at photographs of dead soldiers. The abstract war had become concrete. Could McClellan have ended the war in September 1862 had he acted immediately on the lost order? Most historians who have studied the question believe, yes. The war lasted 3 more years, and its most consequential battle was still to come. July 1863. Robert E. Lee is 56 years old. He has never lost a battle that matters. In the year since Antietam, he has crushed Union armies at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Won at Chancellorsville despite being outnumbered more than 2-1. He believes one more victory, on Northern soil, will force Lincoln to negotiate. The Confederacy does not need to conquer the North. It just needs to make the war so painful that the North gives up. In June 1863, Lee moves his 75,000-man army of Northern Virginia north, through Virginia, across the Potomac, into Pennsylvania. He is aiming for Harrisburg, maybe Philadelphia. He wants to demonstrate that the Confederacy can take the war into the enemy's heartland whenever it chooses. There is one serious problem. Confederate cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, Lee's eyes and ears, responsible for scouting Union positions, has ridden off on an unauthorized sweep around the Union Army. Lee does not know where the Union Army is. He is marching into Pennsylvania essentially blind. On July 1st, advance elements march toward the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, reportedly looking for shoes. They run into Union cavalry under General John Buford, who immediately understands the strategic importance of the high ground south of town. Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top. Buford's cavalry holds on long enough for Union infantry to arrive. The battle explodes without either army fully meaning for it to. By evening of July 1st, Confederates have swept through Gettysburg and driven the Union forces back through the town. Confederate General Richard Ewell stands at the edge of the Union retreat, looking up at Cemetery Hill. Lee's orders, delivered to Ewell that evening, are discretionary. Take the hill, if practicable. Ewell looks at his exhausted men. He looks at the gathering darkness. He looks at the unknown strength of Union forces atop the hill. He decides it isn't practicable. Historians have been arguing about that decision for 160 years. If Ewell had taken Cemetery Hill on the evening of July the 1st, the entire defensive line the Union held for the next 2 days might not have existed. Lee might have won at Gettysburg. The war might have ended differently. Ewell did not take the hill. The Union used the night to fortify it. July 2nd, the second day. Confederate General James Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, argues against attacking the Union's fortified position. He wants to maneuver around the Union left, get between the Union Army and Washington, and force the Union to attack the Confederates on ground of Lee's choosing. Lee refuses. "The enemy is there," he says, pointing at Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to attack him there." Confederate forces attack through a peach orchard, a wheat field, and a boulder field called the Devil's Den. The fighting is some of the most savage of the entire war, and it nearly works. Confederate forces reach the base of a small hill called Little Round Top, the far left end of the entire Union defensive line. If they take it, they can place artillery there and enfilade the entire Union position from flank to flank. The Union has almost forgotten to defend it. Brigadier General Gouverneur Warren, the Union Army's chief engineer, climbs Little Round Top at almost the exact moment the Confederate assault begins. He sees the hill is nearly undefended. He rides frantically to find any available troops. The first regiment he stops is the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry, under the command of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a 34-year-old professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College. No military training before the war. A man who had to read tactics manuals at night to stay ahead of his own soldiers. Chamberlain's regiment takes position at the extreme left end of the Union line. He is told he must hold at all costs. There are no reinforcements. He cannot retreat. The 15th Alabama Confederate Infantry charges up the hill. Chamberlain's men beat them back. The Confederates charge again, and again, and again. Each time, Chamberlain's line shrinks. Men are dying on both sides. The 20th Maine is nearly out of ammunition. Chamberlain makes a decision that military historians still teach as a model of battlefield improvisation. Unable to hold, unwilling to retreat, out of ammunition. He orders a bayonet charge, downhill, into the oncoming Confederates. The surprise of it, 200 men screaming and charging downhill with bayonets when the Confederates expected them to be collapsing, breaks the Confederate assault. The 20th Maine captures nearly 400 prisoners. Little Round Top holds. The Union line holds. July 3rd. The third and final day. Lee has attacked the Union right on day 1. He has attacked the Union left on day 2. Both flanks have held. His generals urge him not to attack the center. Longstreet will say afterward that he argued against what became known as Pickett's charge more strongly than he had argued against anything in his life. Lee overrules him. July 3rd, 1863. 1:07 in the afternoon. 150 Confederate artillery pieces open fire on the Union center. The largest artillery barrage ever seen on the North American continent to that point. The cannon smoke is so thick that Confederate observers cannot see where their shells are landing. Most shots overshoot the Union line and explode harmlessly in the fields behind it. 3 in the afternoon. 12,500 Confederate soldiers step out of the tree line on Seminary Ridge and begin the 3/4-mile walk across open ground toward the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. They dress their lines as they walk. They close gaps when canister tears through their formations. They carry battle flags and move in formation, as if on parade. The Union artillery tears into them. Then the rifles, a small number, a few hundred, actually reach the Union line at a low stone wall. There is hand-to-hand fighting. For a moment, the Union line seems to break. Then Union reinforcements surge forward. The Confederates at the wall are killed or captured. The survivors turn and walk, not run, walk, back across the field to Seminary Ridge. In 50 minutes, Pickett's charge has cost the Confederacy more than 6,000 men. Somber. Some brigades lose 60, 70, even 80% of their strength. Lee rides forward to meet the survivors. "It's all my fault," he tells them. He says it more than once. "It is I who have lost this fight." He had 51,000 total casualties at Gettysburg across 3 days. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia retreats across the Potomac and never invades the North again. On the same day, July 4, 1863, Ulysses S. Grant accepts the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi after a 47-day siege. The Confederacy is cut in half. The Mississippi River belongs to the Union from source to mouth. The outcome of the war is no longer in doubt, to military professionals, to foreign observers, and increasingly to the Confederate leadership itself. The war lasted 2 more years. 250,000 more men would die. Some of them knew it was hopeless. They fought anyway. After Gettysburg, Lincoln finally found his general. He summoned Ulysses S. Grant from the Western Theater, gave him command of all Union armies, promoted him to lieutenant general, a rank held previously only by George Washington and Winfield Scott. Grant came east in March 1864 with a simple strategy: fight Lee continuously, never stop, never give him time to rest or reorganize. The Union had more men. Use them. What followed was the Overland Campaign, 55 days of nearly uninterrupted combat from May through June 1864. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. In the Wilderness, fighting took place in dense forests so thick that artillery was useless, and men navigated by the sound of gunfire. The woods caught fire. Wounded soldiers burned alive. Neither side could see the other clearly enough to know if they were winning or losing. Grant lost 17,000 men in 2 days. Every previous Union commander had retreated after losses like that. Grant turned south and kept moving. His men marched past him that evening. When they realized he was heading toward Richmond, not back toward Washington, they began to cheer. For the first time, Union soldiers believed they had a general who would see it through to the end. At Cold Harbor, Virginia, on June 3, 1864, Grant ordered a frontal assault on well-fortified Confederate positions. Union soldiers the night before the attack pinned their names and addresses to the backs of their coats, so their bodies could be identified. 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded in less than 20 minutes. Grant later wrote in his memoirs that Cold Harbor was the one attack he always regretted. By June 1864, Grant had suffered 65,000 casualties, more than Lee's entire army. The Northern press called him a butcher. Peace Democrats, the Copperheads, used the casualty figures to argue for a negotiated peace. Lincoln's re-election in November looked increasingly uncertain. And then, Atlanta fell. William Tecumseh Sherman had been pushing through Georgia since May 1864. On September 2nd, Confederate forces evacuated Atlanta. Sherman's army marched in the next morning. Lincoln announced the news to cheering crowds in Washington. The Union's fortunes reversed overnight. In November, Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the popular vote. Among the soldiers, he won 78%. The men doing the dying voted overwhelmingly to keep doing it, rather than accept a peace that left the Confederacy standing and slavery intact. Sherman burned Atlanta and began his march to the sea. 60,000 troops cutting a path 60 miles wide and 300 miles long from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. The first modern total war, targeting not just the Confederate Army, but the Confederate economy and civilian morale. Sherman's orders forbade the murder of civilians and the burning of inhabited buildings. His orders were not always followed. His army liberated hundreds of thousands of enslaved people as it moved through the Deep South. They destroyed railroads, warehouses, mills, and plantations, anything that fed the Confederate war machine. He called it making Georgia howl. His critics called it barbarism. Sherman called it military necessity. "We are not only fighting hostile armies," he said, "but a hostile people." Historians are still arguing about Sherman's march. It was unquestionably devastating to the civilian population. It was also unquestionably effective in breaking Confederate logistics and morale. By April 1865, the Confederacy was finished. Lee's army, besieged at Petersburg, Virginia, for 9 months, finally broke through on April 2nd. Richmond fell the next day. Jefferson Davis fled south with his cabinet, his dreams of a Confederate government in exile dissolving with every mile. On April 9, 1865, Lee rode to a farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. He met Ulysses S. Grant. The two men had met once before, briefly, during the Mexican War. Grant remembered it. Lee did not. Grant's terms were generous, deliberately so. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms. All soldiers could keep their horses for the spring planting. They would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason. They would simply go home. Grant told his men not to cheer. This was not a moment for celebrating. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." On April 14th, Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. The crowd cheered when he entered the presidential box. He smiled and waved. He was, by all accounts, in extraordinary good spirits that evening. He had been having a recurring dream, a ship sailing toward a dark and indefinite shore. He told his cabinet he always had this dream before great events. He believed it meant good news was coming. At 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth stepped into the presidential box and fired a single-shot Derringer pistol into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house. He never regained consciousness. At 7:22 in the morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside. He said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The man who had authored the Emancipation Proclamation, who had won re-election on a promise of malice toward none and charity for all, who had spent 4 years trying to end the war with enough grace that the nation could actually heal, was gone. What followed would determine whether the sacrifice of 600,000 Americans had meant anything at all. The war ended. The argument began. Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877, when the federal government attempted to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million formerly enslaved people into American civic life, is one of the most consequential and most ignored chapters in American history. For a brief period, it seemed to work. Black men voted in large numbers across the South. 16 black men served in the U.S. Congress during Reconstruction, including 2 U.S. senators from Mississippi. Black communities built schools and churches and businesses. Hiram Revels became the first black man to serve in the U.S. Senate, occupying the same seat that Jefferson Davis had held before the war. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. On paper, the promise of the Declaration of Independence was finally being extended to all Americans. Then came the Compromise of 1877. The 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden ended in a disputed electoral count. A backroom deal gave Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. Without federal enforcement, Reconstruction collapsed almost overnight. The white supremacist governments that returned to power in southern states implemented what became known as Jim Crow, a system of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and terror that would define Southern life for the next 90 years. Black men were stripped of the vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright intimidation. Between 1882 and 1968, more than 4,000 black Americans were lynched. Most of the perpetrators were never charged. Many were celebrated. The Reconstruction Amendments remained on the books. The promises they represented were hollow for nearly a century, and in the wreckage of defeat, the former Confederacy began building something new. A story. The Lost Cause mythology was not accidental. It was constructed by former Confederate officers writing memoirs that airbrush slavery out of the war's causes, by Southern women's organizations erecting monuments on courthouse lawns and in public squares, by textbook publishers in Southern states who taught generations of children a version of history that bore little resemblance to what the Confederate leaders themselves had said in 1861. The story it told was specific. The Confederate cause was noble and heroic, a defense of honor and constitutional principle, only defeated by the North's overwhelming industrial superiority. Southern soldiers had not fought for slavery. They had fought for their homes, their families, their way of life. Slavery, was a footnote, or, in many versions, a benevolent institution that had actually civilized an inferior race. Jefferson Davis, in his two-volume memoir published in 1881, barely mentions slavery as a cause of secession. Alexander Stephens, who in March 1861 had called slavery the Confederacy's cornerstone, rewrote history by 1868 to argue the war was about constitutional principle. The same man, completely different story. The Lost Cause rewrote the war, and it worked. For much of the 20th century, it defined how the Civil War was taught in Southern schools, how it was portrayed in film and literature, how it was remembered in public spaces. In 1915, D.W. Griffith released Birth of a Nation, a film that portrayed Reconstruction as a disaster of black misrule, depicted the Ku Klux Klan as heroic defenders of white womanhood, and presented the assassination of Lincoln as a tragedy that had prevented the proper restoration of white Southern rule. President Woodrow Wilson, a Virginian, screened it in the White House. He reportedly said it was like writing history with lightning. The film was the most popular movie in American history to that point. The modern Ku Klux Klan, dormant since the 1870s, was revived in 1915, inspired partly by the film. At its peak in the early 1920s, it claimed between 4 and 6 million members, not just in the South, but across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. The Confederate monuments that now stand in courthouses and state capitals were not built in 1865. Most were built in two distinct waves, one between 1900 and 1920, the period of Jim Crow's codification and the nadir of racial violence against black Americans. A second between 1954 and 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement, as black Americans finally began winning the legal battles for the rights promised in 1865. The timing is not coincidental. The monuments were not memorials to the dead. They were declarations of power, statements about who controlled public space and what story would be told in it. Understanding this does not require condemning every person who ever felt something while looking at a Confederate statue. History is complicated. Family is complicated. Memory is complicated. The Civil War happened. People fought in it. People died in it, on both sides. But history also happened. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were gutted in practice for 90 years. 4 million formerly enslaved people were promised freedom and citizenship, and then abandoned by the nation that made the promise. The argument about the Civil War was never really about statues or flags. It was about whether the promise made in 1863 and 1865 would ever be kept. That argument is still happening. In legislatures debating voting rights, in courtrooms deciding the limits of federal power, in schools arguing over what history to teach and what to leave out, in cities deciding which names to put on their street signs. The Civil War is not in the past. The Civil War is in the architecture of American law, the demographics of American wealth, the geography of American cities, the texture of American politics. 625,000 Americans died. They died fighting over whether 4 million people would be enslaved or free, over whether a nation that called itself a democracy could endure its own contradictions. The war answered one question. The Union survived. Slavery ended. It left another one unanswered. What does freedom actually mean? What is it worth? Who gets to have it? We are still working on that one. And that is why Americans still argue about the Civil War.